thank you all for being here. And we're very proud of having established this. I want to say right from the beginning, thank you to a few people. John McCabe, my colleague from the Free Speech Project in Washington, about the calmest person I've ever met, has really been a key person in building this over the last 4 months. And we're very proud that we're presenting this program entirely with local Twin Cities talent. We found people to talk about all these issues who live and work here and who have the experience of Minnesota and the upper Midwest to draw upon. I also want to thank very much President Fanice Miller of Hamline University, who has boldly stepped forward and been willing to sponsor this program in a very meaningful way. We've had a lot of contact with each other and with her colleague, Rebecca Neal, from the Center for Excellence in Urban Teaching at Hamline University, and has worked with John and me very closely all along. And you don't find partners like that very often in very many places, and we're deeply appreciative and understand that you're committed to these issues. So that's really a great thing. And there are lots of other people I could thank, some of them already in the room, some of them coming, but it's been a great experience putting this together, even from 1,200 miles away. So our opening panel is meant to sort of set the parameters of the problem. Jane Kirtley, who's a Silha professor at University of Minnesota, I knew her early in her career and earlier in mine when I was Dean of the School of Communication at American University in Washington. And Jane taught our students about the law while she was also executive director of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, which was a very significant, we think we have trouble today. In the 1970s, we really had a lot to worry about in Washington, and Jane marshaled people's attention and their intellectual weight to address those problems in a very effective manner. So we appreciate it. David Schultz, I'm told, is a real figure in the Twin Cities, a university professor at Hamline University and a whole list of departments there, and a very well-known commentator on these issues. And so we deliberately stuck with just 2 panelists in the first session of this symposium so that we could set the scene a little bit and the 3 of us could have a conversation about the nature of the free speech problem. I learned earlier today when Jane and I were on Minnesota Public Radio together that she does not think it's a crisis. And so it's always good to check the basics before you go further. So without further ado, as they used to say, Jane, I thought you might tell us what you think the nature of the problem is. And David, you'll follow up with that, and then we'll have a discussion and invite questions and comments from the floor after about 3/4 of an hour. Jane?
Thank you, Sandy. And hi, everybody. And I do want to thank the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation and the Free Speech Project at Georgetown for convening this event. And I'm very excited about it. And I'm thrilled that we're starting the whole process here in the Twin Cities. I'm supposed to describe the national free speech crisis. And as Sandy said, I'm not prepared to concede that there is one. And the reason that I say that is because, as he alluded to, not too gracefully, I've been doing this work for a really long time. And when I look at it in the context of where we are today and where we were back in, say, the early 1980s, I'm not sure that the sky is really falling. But when Sandy gave me this topic, I thought I was reminded of A Tale of Two Cities, not Minneapolis and St. Paul, but Paris and London, and what Charles Dickens said about it being the best of times and the worst of times, and I think that's where we are. We have the ability to communicate and access information virtually, instantaneously, around the world. We can hear speeches, we can read essays, we can express ourselves on numerous platforms that cater to every taste and every point of view. All that required is connecting a device that you can hold in the palm of your hand. On the other hand, we have the curse of being subjected to what some people call hate speech, deliberate misinformation and disinformation, risking that somebody will install malware on our device when we connect to the internet, and of course, indiscriminately collect and sell our personal information. One of my big interests in my research is data privacy, and I think we have to concede that privacy as a legal right or even a concept seems to have pretty much evaporated into the ether. So this expansive world of mass communications, on the one hand, has made it more difficult for autocrats and dictators to suppress opposition and criticism. But it's also easy for us to elect to channel our communications to receive only those with which we agree and to avoid anything that challenges our thinking. And in this country, we're scrambling to figure out how we're going to regulate and whether we're going to regulate social media in particular. In Europe, there's a huge groundswell of support for this. And of course, they're not impeded by this pesky First Amendment that we have to keep alluding to, and which I know the next panel will talk about in a lot more detail. But think about it for a minute. It was only a few years ago that only a very small group of people could discover the history of bad actors, bad behaviors, or somebody like, say, Elon Musk, and it could not be done anonymously. It carried a lot of risk, and to some extent, of course, it still does. The legacy systems for collecting and distributing information previously were pretty much non-participatory and centralized, and only a powerful few could make information available to a large audience. But now, thanks to the internet, veracity in public life is, I believe, on a rising curve. That may sound counterintuitive, but again, political statements can now be verified by individual members of the public, with much greater ease than was ever possible before. The shroud of secrecy that has hung over government corruption is now vulnerable to more intense digital monitoring. Falsehoods are easier to detect, to disentangle, and even to destroy. And I think of the specific example of Minneapolis, where I live. The George Floyd case, which all began with what? A viral video shot by Narnella Frazier, led not only to the greater respect for and perception of justice, but in our specific world here in Minnesota, has finally driven the wedge into what had been a long determined idea that seemingly would never go away, that we could not have cameras in our criminal courts. The expansion adopted by the state Supreme Court would not have happened without the ability to access those live streams through the internet, I genuinely believe. I mean, it might have happened, but not in my lifetime. On the other hand, social media have allowed the angry, the alienated, and the disaffected to amplify their distortions in a way that was not possible before, mercifully. Rather than operating in lonely isolation, they find that there are others like them, which gives them comfort, a sense of purpose and legitimacy, which can certainly have negative consequences in the areas of things like public health and even the stability of democracy itself. But if we think back to the First Amendment and what James Madison said about the guardrail of representative democracy being free speech, I think a lot of people think that guardrail has been breached. Is there a democratic way, small d, to restore those guidelines? Is the rising autocracies that we're seeing around the world, is that the answer? Or maybe some American version of expansive government regulation? Call me cynical, but I believe that government regulation, such as the laws in Florida and Texas that are forbidding digital platforms to now monitor and police content, seldom, if ever, get it right. Consider the history of libel and privacy law. We know that free speech is the essential tool of the weak against the powerful and of the common person against the tyrant. But as libel and privacy laws have shown, regulation can result in the reverse, where the protective aspect only protects the powerful and disadvantages those without power. Perhaps the price of holding power to account is to accept that there are risks to greater freedom of speech. When we have governments that criminalize protests that are too rude or too noisy, wouldn't we be wise to be deeply skeptical about government proposals to manage any kind of speech? Having a reasonably free society comes at a cost. A totalitarian society exacts other kinds of costs, and we make a choice, and we will invariably pay the price one way or the other. A society that values freedom of speech is necessarily a dynamic and discordant one, and sometimes individuals suffer harm or cause harm to others. This is unfortunate, and I concede that, but I think it is also inevitable. Instead of trying to stifle discourse we consider to be dangerous or problematic, surely it is better to focus on making sure that accurate, vetted, and proven information is widely and readily available. After all, that concept is anathema to autocrats, but it is the lifeblood of democracy. And I'm going to stop there, Sandy, for now.
Thank you, David.
Great, thank
Do you have your microphone on, by the way?
I do have it on. Is it working? We're perfect, good. I was thinking of starting off with a statement that says what? Free speech for me, but not for thee. And I say that because I actually do think there's a crisis. I do think there's a problem with the first, in terms of how we view speech in our society. Now, of course, by comparison to the Soviet Union days, Nazi Germany, there probably isn't a crisis, but I still think there is. And there's not going to be a single one crisis, a single one problem. As I oftentimes say to my students, we live in a society that thinks there's a single cause and a single silver bullet for everything. I'm going to argue that the crisis is far more complicated than we think, and I'm going to walk through what I think are several of those different possibilities. One of them, again, I'm an empirical political scientist. I believe at the end of the day that data is a really good way to operate from. And if we start to look at data of American public opinion, yeah, in theory, what we're seeing is American public saying, yeah, I support free speech, I believe in free speech, et cetera, et cetera. But then we start to parse it even more, which is why I quoted the line, free speech for me, but not for thee. We can see increasingly across from both the right and from the left, increasing intolerance for views that are opposite of theirs. That we increasingly see those coming from a small percentage on the left and a small percentage on the right, saying that, for example, we should not have people who engage in hate speech, or we should not tolerate people who say things I disagree with, or people who speak their mind, who say things that are offensive. I, as the person who is offended, should have the right to say, this offends me, and therefore you should not be able to speak. But this comes from both sides. We have data that the public is increasingly skeptical regarding the scope and the viability of the First Amendment of free speech in terms of being able to really operate as what we hope it would operate at one point, as the marketplace of ideas. Instead, there's an idea of saying, maybe kind of using what you're saying here, maybe we ought to regulate the market. Maybe we ought to perhaps pick winners and losers in terms of what is right versus what is not correct. That's one aspect. And we see that especially across a generational divide. If we were to look at data that goes from roughly the baby boomers, Gen X, Gen Z, et cetera, like that, increasingly there is stronger and stronger evidence that among the millennials and Gen Z, greater support for limiting speech than we see for older generations. And that becomes kind of sort of a scary notion to think about. Second is that I'm going to pick is that I think perhaps one of the greatest threats to speech in America right now is a corporatization of speech and the corporatization of information in our society. Bernard Bagadin, famous journalist, wrung his hands 30 to 40 years ago and lamented the fact that there were 30 companies that controlled the media markets in the United States. We're down to what? roughly 5 companies in the United States vertically and horizontally control the media market in America. We have commodified information. We have corporatized the control of information and speech in our society. I view that as an enormous another aspect of sort of the threat to free speech in our society. And with that, for some of you who are former journalists and perhaps current journalists, maybe I take off of the old, all the news that's fit to print, from the New York Times to what? All the news that pays we print. It is about the commoditization of information. It is about what? The fragmentation and centralization of the media markets that is producing what? News or information to appeal to particular segments of our society. It is not telling people what they need to hear. It is telling people what they want to hear, and telling people what they want to hear is equated with profits. That is another aspect of it. A third aspect, I want to lift that here, is a collision. I am teaching a class this semester on the relationship between the First Amendment, free speech, and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. How do we bring the two together? How do we say that I have the ability, the right to be able to express certain things, but at the same time separate that out and to draw boundaries between that, and when at what point does speech lead to discrimination? At what point does speech reinforce or reify or accentuate social discrimination in our society? And there's a tension there. A tension that is twisting into a conflict at this point. That again, increasingly we see people skeptical about the fact that in the interest of promoting a more egalitarian society, that perhaps we need to be limiting what people can say. Additionally, again, I'm giving you lots of different pieces of the puzzle here. There is also a push. If we think about what the First Amendment was about, the first phrase, Congress shall make no law. Eventually, we expand that to state and local governments. But there are credible legal scholars, credible people in our society who are saying that it is not just about limiting the government's ability to regulate speech, but we need to ask the government to step in to limit social speech, to limit speech of private individuals, because the speech that individuals engage in, what we normally would consider to be what? Private chatter or comments that we make, that too can pose a threat in our society. A couple of last points. There is this sense also at the same time, and again, in my First Amendment class, I spend a lot of time asking my students, not only what is the importance of free speech, but I kind of draw a little diagram on the board. I'm not a very good artist, and it looks like a bucket. And I say to them, what goes in the bucket that's counted as free speech, and what does not go in the bucket? But also, and so we try to figure out what goes in, what doesn't go on. When does things cross from the line from speech to something else? But in the process, what we're starting to see is maybe a different aspect. Many people have come to argue, and I think this is correct, that the current U.S. Supreme Court and is starting to view increasingly speech as a weapon. That any efforts, legitimate efforts to try to regulate our society, any legitimate efforts to address anti-discrimination, such as what? Situations about the Masterpiece Cake case, Baker Shop, or so forth. Any efforts to address discrimination in our society infringe on free speech. Any efforts to try to regulate money in politics is a limitation on free speech. It is, to a large extent, the weaponizing of the First Amendment. And then just a couple of last things here is that I think one of the other concerns that I increasingly see is that I go back to my days in graduate school. Ben Barber at Rutgers University, one of my professors, he wrote a wonderful book called Strong Democracy. And he argued that the problem in our society isn't that there's too much speech. The problem is there's too little listening. And there's very little time spent. Everybody wants to shout. Everybody wants a megaphone. But conversation is two-way, folks. It requires the capacity to listen. It requires active listening. And we're losing that. There's almost a sense in which, if I think about the phrase freedom of speech, and I'm not sure how I want this to go. I'm not sure if I want to say the more freedom we have, the less speech we have, or the more speech we have, the less freedom we have. But what I'm trying to capture here is that we have an incredible amount of chatter. We have an incredible amount of noise in our society. But what we're not thinking about at the end of the day are the larger goals of what the First Amendment and free speech are supposed to have. And I think because we've lost that. We've lost that faith. We've lost that faith in the First Amendment that empirical studies point to. And to me, all this together, for lots of different reasons, paints the picture for the crisis of speech in America today.
Some interesting issues are on the table. I would like to go back to what is still fairly recent history, but for some people seems very, very distant. But the 1960s, 70s, the time of Spiro Agnew, vice president. My students today have never heard of Spiro Agnew, which I find just amazing. But when he was sent out on the road by his boss, Richard Nixon, to attack the media, and he had speechwriters who were great at alliterations. You remember he called media nattering nabobs of negativism and things like that. And it was very entertaining at the time until it wasn't so entertaining, and there were grand juries asking for people's sources and things like that were happening. How do we perform this very difficult operation of comparing today's circumstances to those of 50 or 60 years ago, and some things in between, including the accusations after 9/11 about disloyalty if one didn't get on the bandwagon for the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, for example. How do we describe this spectrum, and are we in a worse point or a less bad point? I don't want to say at a better point because it's very hard for me to imagine that personally.
Well, I think every era has its own set of crises. There was a great exhibition that was done at the University of Minnesota some years ago, going back to the 1930s, about suppression of speech on campus, suppression of certain categories of professors and students, not being allowed to enroll, not being allowed to keep their jobs. A lot of it was driven by the communist fear at that time. We've got different enemies at different points in our history. I used to say, when I went out on the speaking circuit, especially when I was still at the Reporters Committee, that I felt like this was driven by fear. And I'd always say we're not a fearful people, and we should be brave enough to stand up to opposition or ideas that frighten us, that challenge us. You know, things like the civil rights movement, I arguably could never have taken off in the way that it did had it not been for the First Amendment protections that both protesters and the journalists writing about them enjoyed. But that was a scary time in our history. The Vietnam War was a scary time in our history. We've always had periods of divisiveness, and I don't see that as new. And I think the thing that I would say, just one quick positive, and it's kind of a parochial positive to say, you alluded to journalists being surveilled by the Nixon administration. That happened to the New York Times bureaus in Atlanta, Georgia, for example. There were certainly many cases involving journalists that were being hauled before grand juries and being threatened with or jailed for refusing to reveal sources. Last year, our Justice Department issued a new directive that says we're not going to subpoena journalists anymore, except in very, very limited circumstances. That's a victory. That's a huge victory, but it took an awfully long time to get there. So I do think the arc of history, bends towards justice, but it does take time. I think the danger because, you know, you're a historian, and I know there are other historians in the audience, is to suggest that somehow we're in a unique sense of peril today. I don't think we are. I think this is just another in a long series of perils. Whether we have the mettle to stand up to it is a fair question. But again, I've seen positive things happen. And certainly if I compare to where we are today to where we were during the Reagan administration when I was working at the Reporters Committee, I think we've made tremendous progress. Footnote, I will say though, you know, you were talking about Spiro Agnew and his nattering nabobs of negativism. We had, for some 4 years, a president who referred to the press as the enemy of the American people. Not that different, really, on the face of it. I guess the main distinction we would draw today is that we're now seeing more direct attacks on the press coming not just from the government, but from supporters of certain aspects of the government as well.
Yes, to clarify on that same footnote, Jane, I actually think that in retrospect, Spiro Agnew was a clown, was a performer. Donald Trump, with his unique sneer and unique capacity to excite audiences, I think really meant it that the media were the enemies of the people, and persuaded a lot of people that's the case. So I've thought hard about it and think that that's worse than it was before. On the other hand, during the Nixon administration, people were subpoenaed before grand juries. There were some very, very troubling things. I mean, you remember the name Earl Caldwell from the New York Times, who went to jail rather than reveal his sources, and was a real hero of that moment. I think, you know.
Can I chime in?
Yes, please do.
Yeah.
We should just have a
Yeah,
conversation here.
Probably in the course of a year, I give probably in the course of a year, I give probably about 50 talks in a year. And one of the ones that seems relatively popular is people come and say to me, for one of my talks about American politics, their hands will be wringing, and they'll say something to the effect of, isn't this the most polarized, divided we've ever been in American history? And I'll always pause and say, hell, Civil War beats the heck out of this, just right off the bat. But then I'll say, the early 60s, killing a president, killing his brother, killing 2 civil rights leaders, pretty bad in terms of polarization. But what I'm getting at here is that if we look at public opinion, again, public opinion data, what's fascinating is that American public opinion, the 60s and into the 70s, formed a bell curve. That if we looked at Harris, we looked at Gallup, we looked at the major polls of the day, public opinion converged toward the center on a lot of basic values, a few fringe left, few fringe right. I can't do the whole story today, but now if we look at American public opinion, it's a bimodal curve. We live in an incredibly polarized society. And the reason why I mention this is that part of what's driving our disagreement in our society. So first off, 2 things. First is that we always want to say it was worse then as opposed to now. Maybe yes, maybe no. I don't know if I'm talking about us looking through rose-colored or non-rose-colored glasses in terms of what we have here. But clearly we're dealing with something new now that we haven't seen in a long time, which is first, is that degree of polarization that, by the way, we really didn't even have to this degree during the 1960s. Yeah, we were divided over Vietnam, but even when Nixon pulled us out of Vietnam, barely a majority of the public opposed that. So we got to keep that in mind. The other thing is that what I think is different now, and I talked about this in my class this morning with my students, our constitutional framers believed that creating a pluralist, diverse society, let, proverbially speaking, 1,000 voices bloom, would basically make it possible and difficult for people to find other crazy people like them. My words, not the framers. The transformation of telecommunications, where the rapidity of information, but the rapidity of finding other people to share your views, has really dramatically transformed our society. For every Black Lives Matter group that's out there, there's a Proud Boys. And that's what I'm sort of getting at here now, is that there is something fundamentally different. Whether it's worse, better, whatever, I don't know. But we have to recognize a very different set of conditions operating now than we had during the 70s with Nixon, 60s civil rights movement, Vietnam War, et cetera.
You know, the comparison to Charles Dickens before made me think, you know, best of times, worst of times. I can tell you've moved to Minnesota, Jane, because in DC, at the moment, for better or worse, we have really come to believe that we are living in the worst of times. I'm sorry?
A member of the audience just characterized that as the Beltway syndrome.
Beltway syndrome.
In case our
I don't
viewers
think,
couldn't hear that.
yes, I'm sorry. I don't think it's the Beltway syndrome. I mean, I think it's the Beltway syndrome in the sense that we think that everything important happening in the country, if not the world, is happening inside the, it is magnified, but I think it doesn't feel like the best of times in any respect at the moment. I mean, it is very difficult to get up and feel optimistic. And I do, and I recognize the fact, I come from a small town, I recognize the fact that you get far away from Washington, you can be more optimistic about many things than in Washington.
Well, I read the Washington Post every day, and that's pretty depressing. I agree with that. But I think, again, it's always easy when you're in that Washington bubble, I think. You know, what Congress does, what the Supreme Court does, what the executive branch, multiple alphabet agencies do, is, I mean, that's what DC is all about. And it becomes all encompassing. And I get that. I mean, part of the reason that I came to Minnesota when I did was it was during the Clinton impeachment, and I found the atmosphere so poisonous that I just couldn't stand it anymore. So I get it. I mean, I absolutely get what you're saying, but I think there is a certain myopia that emanates from Washington, which on the one hand thinks it's the most important city in the world, and the fact that for many people, you know, it's negative, it's an encumbrance, it's things they don't like, it's things they put up with. But, you know, even in Washington, I mean, you'd have to concede, I think, that good things have happened in the last 5 years. That helps, I think, to balance the negative. And a lot of the stuff that I think will concern the discussion over the next 2.5 days, really is not emanating from Washington. It's coming from the outland, outstate, as we say here in Minnesota. I mean, that's where the book bans are coming from. That's where all kinds of attempts to restrict freedom of speech or to compel speech are coming from. It's not coming from Congress, at least not successfully.
I'll add one footnote to that. In terms of it, again, go back to classic political science. How democracies are sustained requires both elite support as well as mass support around a cluster of values. That at the end of the day, part of when you talk about the 60s and 70s and what happened is that we had a Supreme Court that issues New York Times versus Sullivan that supports free speech. We had a Supreme Court at the end of the day that says, no, Nixon can't censor the Washington Post, can't prevent the publication of the Pentagon Papers. We had elites. I tell my students, there's this famous scene and I saw a video of it recently of, I can't remember who it was now, but it was Howard Baker. I was on one of these talk shows and from the 70s, and the host is pulling his hair out saying, Nixon did this, Nixon did all this kind of stuff. He's going to get away with it. And Howard Baker turns to him, and remember, he was a Republican, turns to him and says, don't worry, we're going to get Nixon. It's a great line. The elites lined up to say, we're going to get him. I am not sure we have elite support in the way that we did in Washington now for free speech. I am also not convinced, and this is where I agree with you, that across the country, we have the same mass support surrounding First Amendment values. This is my opening comments here. So if you have neither elite support nor mass support for First Amendment, that becomes a scary position for me.
Well, I can tell you after 6 years of accumulating these incidents and documenting them around the country, more than 850 of them now, there are attacks on free speech in every small community. I mean, we know that we've barely scratched the surface. And I'm not saying that 850 is by and of itself a huge number compared to all the things that happen every day. Some good things do happen every day, every place. But there are things taking place in small towns. There are county fairs in Ohio where people are not being allowed in because of the t-shirts they're wearing. There are librarians in the state of Wyoming where they are being threatened with criminal sanctions for where they choose to shelve books in the public library. Small towns, sure, maybe only 100 children will be affected by this compared to, say, if that were being done in Philadelphia, Houston, or what have you, or Minneapolis. But there are things happening that were hard to imagine not so long ago.
A week ago, there was a public meeting and a vote in Carver County, not too far from here.
Yes, which
and,
was
and a narrow vote, and they said, we are going to let the library keep a book.
Right.
I think it was about like I can't remember what the book was, about transgender. What I'm getting at here is that I'm watching it on television, like the story about it, and I'm thinking, I'm glad they let the book in. But I thought to myself, we shouldn't even be having this debate. There should not even be a debate about the fact, and I talked to my students about it on one level, and a couple of my students say, cleaning up their language, if those people don't like the book, don't take the book out and read it yourself. Or one other student said, before you say you don't like the book, go read it and figure out what it is. But I mean, the fact that I'm supporting, we're even having a vote on this scares me.
That's right.
But again, I just have to remind everybody that this is not a new phenomenon.
No, it's not.
Last year, when we had our annual SIL lecture, we had Bob Corn-Revere come out and talk about the whole topic of book banning, and he used as his theme, Inherit the Wind, the famous play and then film about the Scopes monkey trial in Tennessee. We've always had this factor in American society. People that, as I said earlier, are afraid of things they do not know or that challenge their debates or their firmly held beliefs and so forth. I'm just not ready to concede that it has drastically changed. It's just we're living it right now. I have to think that if I'd been living in that small town in Tennessee at the time of that Scopes trial, I would have found it intensely disturbing and frightening and so forth. But, again, so we multiply it a number of times over. And what's the reason that we're more scared now or more concerned now than we would have been 50, 60, 70 years ago? Is it because we can find out so easily that these things are happening now? Is that part of it? Is part of the concern? Because, unless the Baltimore Sun was there covering the Scopes monkey trial, most of the world wouldn't have known about it.
Yeah.
So I think, again, I'm not saying don't be concerned, but to me, that vote was a positive thing. That wouldn't have necessarily gone that way if it had been in the library. The fact that people were engaging and choosing to vote and have their voices heard, again, those voices might have been overcome if they'd been in what we colloquially refer to these days as a red state. I don't know. But to me, the debate and the discussion is a healthy thing.
Well, debate and discussion, of course, is a healthy thing. But to find ourselves debating about whether books can be on the shelves is pretty extreme.
But it's not new. I mean, anybody remember when towns were having bonfires to burn Fahrenheit 451 or Elvis Presley albums? I mean, we have in this country, part of our history, let's admit it, is a mob mentality. It exists. People get caught up in these ideas. And one of the things that I mentioned that David alluded to too is that now these people that represent the extreme views at either end are connecting with other fellow travelers around the country and are making their presence known and their viewpoints felt in a way that was not the case 50, 60 years ago. I'm not sure that's a bad thing. I'm a big believer that we need to get these people out from under the rocks so
yeah,
we
yeah.
can see what's going on.
Okay. Quite a few years ago, they won't mean anything to you. Steve Gottlieb, who teaches at Albany Law School, and I, we were doing an article, and eventually we translated it into a book, and it was trying to look at something all about the concept of toleration, and we were interested in whether or not we had evidence that we were a more tolerant society now than we were, let's say, take us back to the 1950s. And the record is mixed in some ways. I mean, on one level, if we look at attitudes regarding, let us say, gay marriage and so forth like that, clearly we have moved a long distance in some ways. But on the other hand, if we get beyond attitudes, get to practices, in many ways, we are as intolerant or as segregated as society, if I can kind of merge two together here, than the 1950s. Our schools are as segregated today as they were in 1954 before Brown. That is segregated by race, segregated by income. Our neighborhoods are more segregated by race and income now than were before. And what I'm trying to capture a picture here is just in terms of the fact that what we found and what several people have concluded is that on one level, maybe we're not a more tolerant society than we were before. But what we had, at least for some period, and we're losing it, is a better way of managing intolerance. And I think what we're losing is that capacity for how do we manage intolerance? How do we say, I don't agree with you or you don't agree with me, and you and I can walk away, hopefully, and go have a cup of tea afterwards or something like that. But what we don't have are the guardrails in place now for being able to set the parameters and the structure for dealing with disagreement.
David, I have to say I agree with that. And among the things you were citing, you could have also cited that in these great times, child poverty has almost doubled in this country, the level of child poverty. So while we are thankful to have the opportunity to discuss some of these things and to discuss them sometimes in very rarefied circumstances, there are some really profound issues in the society that are somehow not getting worked through with people's speech and opportunity to talk.
And it drives our discourse. Again, we can objectively, measure this out. The gap between the rich and poor is at the greatest it's ever been in our society. We can objectively measure it out with a whole bunch of work by people like Massey and Denton and so forth to look at the degree of segregation in our society. We live in physical bubbles. We live in media bubbles. We live in social media bubbles. We don't interact. We don't converse with one another. And the more we think about the objective inequality in our society, it's probably driving a lot of this disagreement.
Right. Before we take some comments or questions from the audience, and before we turn to Jim Brady, who has arrived now after a grueling trip, and ask him to welcome us all, I just want to, and we're going to have, we have an entire panel coming up tomorrow on book banning. We have an entire panel coming up on Wednesday morning about hate speech. But I just want to touch on the issue of hate speech before we finish talking up here in this question. And speaking very personally, I am a reformed First Amendment absolutist in the sense that I'm more worried about hate speech than I used to be. And what has made me more worried about it is the reality of those 850 plus incidents that we've tracked, many of which are really quite serious examples of hate speech. And I'll cite the one that I could be accused of overemphasizing. But there is a school district in Ohio, at least a purple state, if not in its cities, a progressive state, where a network of homeschool parents was discovered, where Nazi ideology was being taught as part of their homeschooling. And the local authorities looked it over, and said, yes, well, this is too bad, but there's nothing we can do about it. So the ventilation of these things, more speech about it, has not solved it. There's some unknown number of kids in some obscure place in Ohio who are being trained, in effect, at a very early impressionable age, in Nazi ideology. I don't think we can wait around to see if somebody comes back and answers that and everything is okay. And there are many examples of that, like white supremacy, what's allowed to be taught. Can't teach the truth about the history of race relations in this country in Florida anymore. It's illegal. It is illegal.
And I'm going to interrupt you, Sandy, because that's what I
Go
was
ahead.
going to say. I mean, the mirror image of what you're talking about is the laws in Florida. And the problem that I think I see here is trying to define what we mean by hate speech. When we want a governmental body, because presumably the school board in Ohio is the one that's deciding whether these homeschool curricula you're talking about are acceptable or not, whether we want the government to be the one to decide what is orthodox in public thought and public discourse. One of our Supreme Court justices said that's a recipe for disaster. I'm paraphrasing, and I agree. I think the thing we have to remember is that during some important turning points in our history, it was the minority view that was rejected by many, that was characterized as being un-American, unpatriotic, dangerous, the idea of equality among the races. That was hate speech south of the Mason-Dixon line. So, you know, I'm glad, I envy those who have the certitude that can say, I can figure out, you know, it's hate speech for me, but not for thee, paraphrasing what David was saying. I'm glad you feel confident that a governmental body can draw those fine distinctions. I don't feel confident that they can. So what's the solution going to be if it's not government stepping in and regulating?
I think we're asking the First Amendment. I think we agree. We're going to say it in a different way, though. I think we're asking the First Amendment to solve all of our social problems. And I don't think it can. At the end of the day, again, I'll go in a direction that probably nobody here agrees with, is that a student once asked me in a con law class, is there any decision that you think the court made that was really wrong, like on your list of like the worst ones? And I said, yes. And I said, it was giving parents the right, and you're not going to agree with me on this one, to pull their kids out of public school and to do homeschooling and private schooling. To me, one of the great institutions, and again, maybe it's because I'm from New York, is the leveling impact of having everybody in public school together, where you have to deal with people of all ilks and all aspects of life. What we're focusing on here is this problem. The problem of saying that it may not be the speech issue, it may be the underlying conditions that are driving all this kind of stuff. I want to do an example here. I did a First Amendment case the other day from 1942. It's a famous case. I won't bother with the name here, but it involves a person who turned to the crowd and said, "You're all a bunch of racketeers and fascists." And I turned to one of my students and I said to her, "You're a racketeur." And she laughed at me. And I said, "Why?" She goes, "I don't even know what the hell that means." And what I was getting at is to say, in 1942, calling somebody a racketeur, or worse, a fascist, those are fighting words. That's hate speech at that point, at a point where we're at war with the Nazis at this point, to call somebody Nazi. And what I'm getting at here is that for now, my students, I could call them racketeers till the cows come home, and it doesn't mean anything. But for them, it's different words, which I won't use here. And they want to be able to regulate those words. And I say to them, is it the words that hurt, or is it the fact that there is governmental power or social or economic power standing behind those words that makes those words sting?
Well, I just want to say, Jane, I take your criticism seriously about what governmental bodies can do. And I think this is not about government power or not. I think it's about civic culture. I think it's about civil dialogue. I think it's about trying to find ways not to wink at hate speech and say, oh, these are such bad ideas, they will go away. Someone will argue against them and they'll go away. I used to think that, and I'm not so convinced anymore. And there have been enough very bad experiments in the world, but they haven't gone away. And some terrible things have happened as a result.
Well, I think if I could, that's the paradox, isn't it, of freedom of speech. On the
Sure.
one hand, we say, as a famous book once said, they're only words, and you should be able to rise above them. And if you have the courage of your convictions and are comfortable in yourself and high self-esteem and all those things, it's only words and they can be brushed off. But we know that words can hurt. We know that words can be weaponized, and I'm not disputing that point, and I'm not dismissing it as irrelevant to this conversation. But what I'm suggesting is we have the counter weapon, which is more speech. And the day you concede that these hateful words are more powerful than your power of persuasion is the day that you're giving up. And I'm just not prepared to give up.
Well, a very wise friend of mine in Washington believes that if Donald Trump is reelected president, we won't have to worry about elections for quite a while. And I'm not saying that the jury is in on that, but I think we are in a very special time right now. And that may be because of living in DC. I think there is a very, very serious threat to the fundamentals of democracy, and I think part of it is the indifference to what's happening now. Let's see if there are any comments or questions from the audience. Kevin.
Can we pass him a mic?
Yeah, I think one is coming.
Okay, good.
So just hold on a second. Good idea.
Kevin Featherly always has interesting things to say.
Okay. I'm going to turn the conversation in a slightly different direction. And
I
I'm
think
going
that'll
to,
be a relief.
yeah, I'm going to ask you to frame, Jane, what happened to Minkoji, because I'm a litigant and I'm not willing to say that out loud in public. But given what happened, which I'll ask you to explain to the audience, and given some of the other moves that we've seen, I'm with the Minnesota Coalition on Government Information, we see around the country lawyers advising city councils that you don't have to turn over data, that these laws, you're going to get away with this. Now, they're losing their court cases, as the case that I hope you'll explain is likely to be lost as well. But we're only one Supreme Court ruling away from having all of these laws that came in the early 70s vanquished. And I'm wondering if what's happening is that we've had this experience of open government, of data practices, of all these things that have happened since the early 70s, if the effect of those is eroding, and if we're regressing to a pre-1974 mean, and that we're going to be living in a world where this data just isn't available to people.
What Kevin is making reference to, and I'm not involved in the case because I'm not on the Minkoji board anymore, but for those of you who don't know, this is the Minnesota Coalition on Government Information, and it's an NGO, as we say, here in Minnesota that advocates for access to government information, open meetings, and so forth. For more than a year, 2 years now, they've been involved in litigation with the city of Minneapolis trying to get access to coaching data. As you know, this has been a highly contested issue about police misconduct. And the government has been taking a position that this is protected under the very expansive privacy exemptions that exist in our Minnesota open government law, which is called the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act. That's a discussion for another day. I have my own views on that law, but be that as it may. They made a credible argument about whether some of this is not public or private data. But what I think has brought this to the fore in a more bizarre sort of way is that the fact that as this litigation has been going forward, instead of just citing the exemptions that I think the city, perhaps in good faith, is making, I'll concede that, instead of just doing that, they are choosing to weaponize their litigation practices and came back to Minkoji and said, okay, we want a list of the names, addresses, social security numbers, and a variety of other personal information like marital status, which is completely irrelevant to this open records request. It has nothing to do with anything. Why are they doing it? I'll leave it to you to answer that question. My answer would be, it's to intimidate. the point of this story is just to say that instead of having this law being used in good faith by both sides as a means to allow the public to get access to information, and again, if there's a reasonable dispute about what the law says, we can all agree that we'll fight over that and let the court decide what the legislature intended. But instead, we see, and this has happened in other states too, we see governmental entities using these open records requests as a way to get back at the requester, to retaliate against the requester. And in some respects, I suppose, this is a microcosm of what we're seeing in society in general, where people take on those who disagree with their points of view and aren't content to just simply argue about it. They're threatening them. So I agree. This is a matter of great concern. In terms of what this means for the future, you know, the golden days of open records laws, in my estimation, was in the post-Watergate era, where the public was very, rightfully so, very suspicious of the executive branch of government. And although some states had open record laws before that, they really came to the fore in the 1970s. And for the most parts, I think it's fair to say that state courts have been pretty expansive in their interpretation of those laws. It's all based on the idea that there's a presumption of openness, because that's how the public holds government accountable. I agree that there has been some erosion of that, and I think ultimately the weak point in open records litigation, open records law, is getting the public as a whole engaged in the issue. The news media have always cared about this. Special interest groups of varying kind have always cared about it, but the rank and file individual, I think, cares about it intensely when it's something that matters to them, sure, and matters very little when it's not. If you're not always holding the feet to the fire, then yes, we're going to lose the ground that we fought so hard for in the 1970s.
Anyone else?
I could.
Yes, please, David.
Yeah, I will just. I guess I would just sort of simply add the fact that I think you're making the point that I was making before too, is that to some extent there is an erosion of elite support for access to government information. There is this sense in which the elected leaders and public officials that came of age during Watergate or learned the lessons of Watergate, they're gone. They're gone at this point. They have passed on. Kevin and I were talking, having our snacks before we came on here, and I was pointing out the fact that on something as simple as try now to get an individual meeting with a state legislator. Try to get to see if you can go actually have an individual meeting with one of your members of Congress at a town hall. Yeah, granted, there's some security type of issues. Granted, we've gone through also a pandemic. But for the most part, we're looking at elected officials now who have no longer internalized those norms, that want to act in good faith and say, it's the public's right to know. And there was a point where it was reflexive, automatic, that this is your information, you can have it. I remember when I was working in government back in the 80s, I actually had a policy overseeing my government files in my department. It was automatic. Automatically, you could come in if you wanted to look at it. I didn't expect people to fill out reams of paper. I didn't expect them to explain why they wanted it. I viewed it as what? It is your right to inspect this information. I think we have lost that in our society among the elites, or many of the elites.
President Miller.
Fadis Miller. I've got lots of things that are swirling through my head right now, but I want to throw something out on the table, because I always learn that we need to learn from history, and if we don't learn from history, we're going to repeat it. So while we can make the statement is this is not new, what is the impact of what's happening now and for the future? So I want to just throw that on the table, because I think that there are those of us in the community who have spoken out and seen an erosion of our rights to vote, or attempts to erode our right to vote. So while it might not be new in terms of these events happening, the outcome of some of what is happening and the threats to people speaking up has severe consequences. So if we're going to say that, then how do we mitigate? How do we prepare marginalized members of our community to be able to speak without consequences, without laws being put in place or policies being in place that erode the gains that came out of the civil rights movement. I'll even go back to that gave us, 30 acres and a mule that we didn't really get, but we were supposed to get when we got freed. How do we keep some of those things from negatively impacting the lives of people? Because that is what happens when people speak up and speak out. So how do we do that?
Well, I think I'm going to probably defer to David on this because he's the political science sociologist. I'm neither of those two things. But I guess I would say that if we look at the recent history, which the civil rights movement is in the long arc of American history, I mean, it happened in the lifetimes of many of us, including me. I remember it, and I think it was not consequence-free to speak out in those times. There were serious consequences, some including the possibility of losing one's life. And I guess going back to what I said earlier, I don't say this lightly because I recognize that there are genuine threats both to kind of the political system as a whole and to individual liberty and safety. But, you said, how do we convince people to speak up, or how do we convince people to speak up? By telling them that their lives depend on it in a very real way. And I think one of the biggest challenges is to move away from the indifference that affects so many in our society. If it's not hurting me, then I don't really care about it. Is it altruism? Is that what we're looking? Is that what we've lost? Is that what we need? Maybe. I don't know what the answer to that is. But, preserving all of our civil rights, everything that's embodied in the Bill of Rights, has never been a risk-free enterprise. I mean, we've been lucky in this country that it's been vigorously protected by Supreme Court after Supreme Court after Supreme Court, but it has not been a smooth process to get to that point. And I think we're kidding ourselves if we think the work's done and we can stop. The work never stops. It's eternal vigilance, because there's always somebody out there that wants to take your rights away. There's already somebody out there that wants to stop you from speaking because it offends them for one reason or another, because it rocks their world in a way that makes them uncomfortable or frightened. So, the First Amendment, it's not a spectator sport. It's something we all have to engage in. And I tell my students, and I'm sure others on this platform have said this too, your right for freedom of speech is not your right for no consequences from exercising that right. There are going to be consequences, hopefully good trouble, to use the phrase from the civil rights era. But, that's the game. And if you're not prepared to engage in that, then I think you're going to sit by and watch the consequences.
Jane,
I'm not saying that they're not grave consequences, but I guess my point would be that ultimately, yes, they are grave consequences. And so we need to step up and engage. Again, I think what Dave said, we may be asking the First Amendment to do more work here than it's reasonable to expect it to do. It's about your right to speak. The consequences that flow from that are not something that the First Amendment can control, or I would say can even rectify. But what I know, to the fiber of my being, it does not rest in the government suppressing speech, because Sandy was painting a pretty dire picture of what might happen if there's another Trump administration, or I would say even beyond that, those who share President Trump's viewpoints, former President Trump's viewpoints. Yeah, it is concerning to me. But ultimately, it turns us back to the question, why are we so concerned about that? Because an administration that doesn't believe in freedom of speech, that's going to be a real problem. And if we give a future administration the tools to suppress speech that administration doesn't like, where does that leave us? That's why I'm so worried about embracing the idea that government can step in and regulate speech. I don't want to put it in the hands of someone with whom I don't agree.
Jane, I want to point out, I did not say the government should step in and regulate speech. I just want you to realize that. And I do think, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. I think the vigilance is not as vigilant as it needs to be on some occasions. There's a little bit of indifference and kind of, if you're not yourself a victim, this will pass.
Well, I thought I said that. Maybe I didn't say it very well. I agree with that. And as I said, maybe what we need is more altruistic or communitarian view of the world where people can act outside of their bubbles of self-interest.
Well, it's just that some people have suffered much more directly and severely from hate speech. And it's fine for the educated elite to say, oh, just be patient. Just wait, and this problem will solve itself. It will not solve itself. It's going to take a real societal effort, and it's going to take a different kind of commitment.
Yeah, it's going to take more speech, right? It's going to take good speech to argue down that hate speech.
I wish I shared your optimism.
Well, then I don't know what your solution is unless it's to shoot people that you think are uttering hate speech, because if you won't allow government regulation and you won't say that other speech will counterbalance it, then I'm not quite sure what
I'd be
remedies
really
that leaves
disappointed
me.
if I thought you favored shooting, that I favored shooting people, I think.
If I can throw in something here too also, if we look at, first off, it's become increasingly harder for me after 30 years of teaching to end my American politics class with an optimistic note. And what I mean by that, and I oftentimes say there's the cherry tree version of American history, that we live in a big pluralist, happy society where everybody gets along. And unfortunately, that's not the story anymore. Again, as I've hinted here several times, we got the corporatization of our society. We've got enormous racial divides. We have enormous class divides, et cetera, et cetera. And I say that because all this, I think, is impinging upon the discourse in our society and how we view our society. But also, what I say to my students is that if we look at the contour of American history, the Alien and Sedition Acts, efforts to suppress people after World War I, World War II, et cetera, like that. One of the maybe unfortunate stories of American history is that maybe on one level, we've never completely bought into the myth of the First Amendment. That at the end of the day, there's a lot more skepticism regarding it than many of us want to think. We sit in the luxury of the fourth floor of a building in which most of us in this room here probably don't have to worry about day-to-day survival. And I say that this is the arrogance of power. It's the arrogance of affluence. As I say to my students, I teach at Hamline, when they ask me, what does the average person think about something? And I say, let's go down to the university in Snelling and talk to a bunch of people and find out what the hell they think. And we might get some very different views. And the reason why I say this is that I don't know how to solve this problem, is that, as I said, we've got enormous social problems in our society. We need to address the problems of money, of class, of racial discrimination, et cetera, et cetera. We need substantive reform of our basic institutions. I wish I knew how to wave a magic wand and address those issues. I think somewhere in there speech fits in, but I'm going to confess and say, I don't have it all worked out yet. If I had this all worked out, I don't know if I'd be sitting here at this point. I don't know where I would be. But somewhere here, we've got to remember that beyond the First Amendment, there are other problems we need to be addressing. And too often, I think, what do? We think, well, if we just say the right thing or think the right thing, we've solved our problems. Talk may be cheap, but talk alone doesn't change things.
Right, let's take one more comment before we move on.
Hi, my name is Jeff Freeland Nelson. I'm with American Public Media Group. And I'm just curious what connection you see between privacy and speech and generational attitudes toward both. Specifically, an experience we had an advisory board for the program I run, and we had one of those 4 corners exercises, and we asked the question, are you concerned about how big tech is using your data? And all of us went to the corner that said very concerned, except for one person who stood on the opposite side. And the other part, the outlier about that person is he was about 20 or 30 years older or younger younger than the rest of us, a college student, Northwestern. And he said, give up. They're going to get your data. They're going to do what they want. Don't even try. And even last week, there was a study that came out that they asked people, would you support cameras being installed in homes to prevent domestic violence? And something like 27% of people that responded to the survey under 30 said, sure, yeah. So you have young people saying, give up, we're being surveilled, who cares? And you have perhaps older generations saying, hey, let's start limiting speech. How does this, is there a connection here at all?
Yeah, there is a changing notion of what we mean by privacy in our society. And where it really hit me the first time was about, God, I want to say 15 years ago, which means 20 years ago, probably at this point. And at that point, many of my students were Gen Xers. And we were talking about something about privacy. And one of my grad students at Hamline did this incredibly good paper that parsed the public opinion data and pointed out the fact that the Gen Xers and now the millennials and Gen Zs have a very different notion of privacy compared to some old goats like us, like baby boomers. There are things I would never, ever, ever consider posting. I don't know about you. I would never, I mean, at best, I post pictures of I don't know, of my garden or something like that on the social media. Nothing personal whatsoever. But there is this interesting point here that we don't trust the government. But increasingly, we're finding this generational divide that says, as you pointed out here, big tech, okay. Big business, okay. And with that also is not just simply trusting them, but also the fact that they are willing to put out there, I hate to talk in terms of they like that, but my students are willing to put out there information. And again, I don't know if you and I would ever want to put that kind of information out.
I can say that I've been teaching a course in data privacy at the University of Minnesota since 2000. And I have seen a shift among my students over time. But I currently have them read a book called Data and Goliath. And they read it at the beginning of the semester. And at the first class after I asked them to read it, it's by Bruce Schneier, a name that's known here in Minnesota. They come to class and they say, I have just gotten rid of this device. I've just gotten rid of this app. I've just done this. I'm horrified to read this. And this book is not new. It was written in, I think, 2012. It's just that it's the best book I could find that I thought would raise the standard to them about what the real risks and concerns they should have would be. But I think you're right that for the older generation, we concentrated on the idea of the government surveilling us and collecting our information. We seem to have ceded collectively, and when I say we, I really mean Congress has decided it's going to cede the authority to the private sector to collect this kind of information and do whatever they choose with it, with the exception of a few outlier states, and the number's growing more every year, but with the exception of a few outlier states like California and Illinois, state legislatures aren't doing much about it either. And I think to the extent that it's not a matter of compelling concern to students, young people, maybe because, as you've suggested, they say, what's the point of fighting it? We've already given it all away. I mean, to some extent, they're right. Pandora's box has been opened, and there's no putting those evils back into the box. And trying to figure out how to regulate what happens to personal information, I think it's in many ways futile at this point. This all should have been done 30 years ago, and it wasn't.
Just one last sort of footnote to that is that we're having a debate in an American context. Let's go over to Europe and the EU and have a very different debate about this, where there is very robust efforts to say there's a right to be anonymous, that there's a forcing of Google, Alphabet, and so forth to do different things. And maybe we ought to think about the fact that, again, it comes back to me, one of my themes today, partly why isn't Congress acting? Because what? Maybe it's the strength of what? The big corporatization of media in America, which can spend hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, lobbying Congress on things like the Telecommunications Act, was it 1996? I can't forget the exact date or something like that, that basically has unleashed the ability of large corporate entities like Google and all that to pretty much run amok over a whole bunch of things.
Well, they're only responsible to themselves for what they do.
Yeah.
Well, you know, can I just add one point, though, that at heart, part of the issue is that pesky First Amendment. Because if they're collecting personal data, they are choosing to sell it, to publish it, so forth. It's difficult to draw a distinction between that and what journalists do. They collect information and they publish it. I hear a voice out there dissenting. Let me assure you that in Europe, which David was alluding to, when the European Data Protection Directive, which was sort of the grandfather legislation on this particular issue, came out in 1995, one of the hard questions was, is this going to apply to journalists who collect information on the people they report on, who maintain it in their newspaper morgues, now of course all electronic, who make it retrievable on their newspaper sites in perpetuity? How do you square that with this right to be forgotten? So don't be so quick to say that what happens to Meta or what happens to Alphabet will never happen to the news media, because in Europe, they're having a great difficulty drawing that distinction. It all gets us back to the question of who's the press.
I'm going to exercise my right as the moderator right now to end this conversation, this wonderful conversation, and say that some of these issues, there's another opportunity to bring them up later in the afternoon when Mike Burbach and I engage in a discussion about some of the same issues. I do want to invite Jim Brady to say some words of welcome after traveling here a long way to do so, and then we have an important discussion to pick up in just a few minutes. Jim?
And by the way, if you'll excuse me, I do have another engagement I have to do. Thank you very much.
I have to take your seat.
You can have my seat. Good luck to you.
Been standing in an airport for 6 hours, so apologies for not kicking this off when I was supposed to kick it off. But so I think I was supposed to do this at 2:30, but instead I'm doing it about 4 o'clock. And the reason for the Delta is Delta. 4.5 hours in Miami waiting for an air conditioning part for the plane. So apologies for opening this an hour and a half after you've actually opened it. So some of this will probably sound a little odd, but anyway, I'm glad you're all here today. I'm Jim Brady, Vice President of Journalism for Knight Foundation. I'm pleased to welcome you here to Knight's headquarters. This isn't the actual headquarters you're sitting in, but it's in this building right across the hallway. And glad to have you here to have this conversation about the state of free speech. And obviously we're off to a great start already, just from what I heard in the last 20 minutes. I want to start off, tell you a little bit about Knight Foundation, our background, and why we sponsored this event, and hopefully three or four more other ones around the country. And I want to make it clear why Knight, and I suspect most of the people in the room certainly believe in free speech, although we're certainly engaged in an interesting debate about where it starts and where it ends. But the state of the press today is I think, and the state of free speech are both at a crossroads. And I think, did you come up with a name for this? At a crossroads? It's a catchy title. It's not just a catchy title for the symposium, although it is also that, but it is also where we stand today in the country. But I do want to start by talking about the foundation a little bit. In the middle of the last century, the brothers Jack and Jim Knight built one of the most successful newspaper companies in America. They were committed to great journalism and committed to building a good business. But more than anything, they were committed to their communities. And Jack was the editor-in-chief of each Knight paper, but the worst thing you could ever say to Jack Knight was he ran a newspaper chain. Every newspaper was different, every city was different, the needs were different, the communities were different, period. So the Knights knew that St. Paul wasn't Miami, and neither one was San Jose. Each city has its own issues, concerns, and its own sense of self. Each Knight paper reflected that, and as Jack Knight would say, as a well-informed community determining its own true interests, Jack Knight would say was essential to the functioning of democracy, and his newspapers made sure those communities were well-informed. This is part of the reason why the press, I guess not everybody here is in the press, but some of us still consider ourselves in it, even though we're now philanthropists. We, the press, are there in the First Amendment. We're a crucial part of the nation's structure in America. I think this is an important point. In America, our democratic republic is organized by geography. Politics is local, and so is governance. It's on a local, geographically determined basis that we elect the people who pass the laws and regulations that decide our policy and practice, every kind of policy and practice. Local news helps determine those true interests. Almost 75 years ago, Jack and Jim created Knight Foundation to advance their belief in journalistic excellence and strong communities. Beyond that, they left it their successors to determine how to meet those goals. For many years, the foundation really just funded journalism education. And when the rise of the internet in the mid-90s came, we focused more on technological innovation inside journalism. About 5 years ago, we recognized the obvious disaster in front of us, which was the business model of local news organizations, and decided that our focus would become building the sustainability of local news in the United States. This has been our primary focus, and we're actually starting to see some successes. Revenues for small publishers around the country are increasing. There's a higher percentage of publishers that are profitable now than there has ever been in the digital era. Long way to go, but there's real progress happening. One of the things that's been very successful is the American Journalism Project, which has raised about $150 million and is helping provide business support to publishers around the country. It's stood up about 40 news organizations around the country. In just over 10 years, the Texas Tribune, despite a little bump recently with some layoffs, has gone from an experiment to a sustainable business that covers Texas politics in an absolutely essential way. There are dozens of other organizations popping up around the country, and they're shining promise into many underserved communities. So earlier this month, one of the great moments, I think, in this kind of resurgence came when we announced a $500 million Knight, and a bunch of other foundations announced a $500 million effort over 5 years to support local journalism in the United States called Press Forward. Will get started in early 2024, but for the Knight Foundation, we'll double the amount of money we put into local news in the United States. And I would say maybe triple the amount of money that goes into local news philanthropically in the next 5 years. So hopefully now driven with this funds, will help us make up some of what we've lost. Knight also supports the development of engaged, inclusive, and equitable communities in the 26 cities where the Knight brothers owned and operated newspapers, St. Paul being one of them. We've committed more than $90 million over the last 5 years to fund research at universities around the country on the impact of technology on society. We regularly commission research on issues including free expression, media trust, news sustainability, and democratic values. In 2016, we partnered to launch the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University, a $60 million effort, $30 million coming from Knight, $30 million from Columbia, to preserve and expand First Amendment rights in a digital age through research, education, and when necessary, litigation. With all that background, where do we find the state of free speech today? As Jamil Jaffer, the executive director of the Knight First Amendment Institute, has said, the First Amendment shouldn't be thought of as, quote, something to be defended, but as something to be built, not just as something to be protected, but as something to be reclaimed or even reimagined. So our research into attitudes on free speech reveal a number of interesting trends, some that will be exceedingly familiar to our hosts at Hamline University. In our last round of surveys from 2022, we continue to see that Americans from all walks of life appreciate freedom of speech and recognize its benefits to society and democracy. But we also found that many Americans now place equal or more importance on mitigating social challenges that can arise from free speech, like preventing violence or the spread of misinformation. While most Americans feel they enjoy First Amendment protection, some group, like Black Americans, feel notably less protected by these freedoms. Partisan affiliation drives wide-ranging views among Americans as to what constitutes a legitimate expression of First Amendment rights, particularly on topics that have been politicized. Most Americans believe they have a moderately easy time exercising their free speech rights, but most also believe that others, typically those from the opposing political party, have an even easier time. Most Americans say a variety of public and private institutions should prohibit racist speech, but allow political views that are offensive. And our college student survey series, conducted since 2016, has shown that college students broadly support free speech, but see both free speech and the free press as less secure than they did in 2016. Most students believe their campus climate prevents people from expressing their views openly, and at the same time, increasingly favor campus restrictions on speech that targets minority groups. There's much work ahead to debate the rightful place of free speech and free expression in our society. John Stuart Mill, the great 19th century English philosopher, I think made the best argument for the importance of free exchange of ideas. In the second chapter of his landmark On Liberty, Mill wrote, "He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. His reasons may be good, and no one may have been able to refute them, But if he is equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion. Nor is it enough that he should hear the opinions of adversaries from his own teachers presented as they state them and accompanied by what they offer as refutations. He must be able to hear them from persons who actually believe them. He must know them in their most plausible and persuasive form. So over these next few days, let us hear all sides of the case in their most plausible and persuasive forms. And let us start down the path of successfully navigating the perilous crossroads we face. Thanks.